Well, good morning, especially to those live streaming. Welcome back after a brief 2-week hiatus. We will return to our lecture series on Anglicanism 101, What's Anglicanism? And we're going to begin our foray now into the early Middle Ages. We're looking to get through the 10th and 11th centuries today. I'm not sure we'll be able to cover all that material, but we're going to try. And this will set up the remainder of the lecture series, because this sets the foundation for the things about which we're going to discuss when we move forward. Now, if you'll remember, we left off with the Viking invasion of England in the latter part of the 8th and early 9th century. Now, the Frankish kingdom, or what it became known as the Holy Roman Empire, was looking to expand, and this essentially was putting pressure on the southern part of Denmark, Danvirk, if you're interested in what the Danish is, Dannevirke. Well, so if you're talking about the Frankish kingdom, essentially we're talking about modern Germany, and of course the majority of France. And it is in this area moving north where the Holy Roman Empire, or the Frankish kingdom, started to put pressure on the Vikings, which is why they started to expand. They needed to expand. By the latter portion of the 8th century, there is what was to become the diocesan structure of the English Church, and that took place, and that actually settled in for about the next 1,200 years, thank you to Theodore of Tarsus. Now, when we look at the way in which the church was structured within England, right at around this time, you basically had a bishop for each kingdom. So you had Canterbury as the archbishop for Kent. You had the Bishop of London as the Bishop of Essex, the Bishop of Dunwich, which is essentially East Anglia, the Bishop of Winchester, which is the Bishop of Wessex, the Archbishop of York, and pay attention to York, because York becomes a pivotal place in our discussion. The Archbishop of York was the Bishop of Deira, D-E-I-R-A, which was the southern part of Northumberland, and the Bishop of Lindisfarne was the Bishop of Bernicia, which is also the northern part of Northumberland. You got to remember the map we had. And then, of course, there was Bishop of Lichfield, which was Mercia, which always makes me laugh because I always think of Monty Python whenever I hear Mercia. No Monty Python fans. Okay. And part of the reason that this movement, if you will, was instrumental was because it exacerbated some of the things that were going on in Scandinavia at the time. There was overpopulation, there was a shortage of agricultural land, and you couple all of that with what was going on with the Frankish expansion, and it creates a problem for the Danes, for the Vikings. They were the ones that exhibited consistent patterns of trading and raiding along the river systems of Northern Europe, and therefore all of these combined elements pose a major factor in them crossing the channel. Now, the last individual with whom we spoke as far as a ruler was Alfred, okay? And that was 849 to 899. And the most important thing about him is that he was, for all intents and purposes, viewed as a saint. He was a pious man. He loved learning, and unlike most of the kings of his period, he eventually acquired literacy. He was very keen on church reform and keen on codifying the law. He worked out, as best as he could, a way to stop the Danes from becoming a permanent presence in his kingdom by the development and the erection of boroughs. Anybody familiar with the term boroughs? I grew up in New York, in the city, and the city is divided into 5 boroughs, and this is where it comes from. So, and these became a permanent structure, a permanent presence in the kingdom. And these towns then were defended with this borough system, and he gave a lot of attention to the promotion of Christianity, particularly in an evangelistic setting amongst the Danes. So while he was trying to keep England separate, he at least was reaching out. Now, we talked about those 7 bishoprics for this reason, for 2 reasons. Number one, if you'll notice when I was introducing them, I identified them all as archbishop. They were all archbishops, archbishoprics. That will become an issue later on. But as time progressed, some of them begin to disappear. Lindsay disappears around the early 9th century, 810 to 812. Leicester is moved southward to Dorchester-on-Thames, out of the immediate Danish area. And the Archbishop of York is kept around by the Danish kings simply to keep some sort of control between the north and the south, but he was kept on a very, very, very short leash in order to control the Anglo-Saxon population. This is a time period where many church institutions like monasticism, various church schools, go through an extremely difficult time. For about 100 years, there is trouble and there is turmoil. The Vikings are still very much present in terms of northern England. Places, names, dialects, differences in attitude between the north and south still manifest a sort of a hangover, if you will, for having been separate kingdoms. And this situation, this animosity, essentially continued all through the Middle Ages. Then we wind up coming into, and I'm going to pause right here for just a second by making this this statement. Remember, the point of what we're doing here is not to give a comprehensive presentation of the history of England. We're focusing on those elements of the history of England that provide us information to identify what Anglicanism is in and of itself, not with any dependence on anybody else per se, that she has a distinct identity of her own, and this information that I'm presenting is the foundational information that shows you how this continues to develop and how England maintains a very distinct identity separate from what everybody claims, Rome. Everybody claims that Anglicanism is nothing more than Roman light, and that is not accurate. Okay? So when I mention people, keep in mind there are a vast number of very, very important, very significant individuals that will not be mentioned. I just don't have the time. I'll mention a couple of them just by name later on so that you can see how we're really glossing over a lot of stuff. The interesting part at this time to keep in mind is that we have a gentleman named Aelfric, Elfric, and he was the novice master of the Cerne Abbey, and in 967 he wrote 2 series of homilies intended to cover the church year, and the second was more elaborate than the first. He intended to introduce to his more, quote-unquote, simple countrymen the religious thought of the West. And that religious thought, according to Alfric, was exemplified in St. Augustine of Hippo. Wasn't an original thinker, but he was a magnificent interpreter, and he was not only considered the most distinguished prose writer of his time, but he was also considered one of the most significant, if not the most distinguished prose writer for the next 500 years. His work is viewed by many to have actually contributed to saving the identity and the ethos of Great Britain, at least for the time being. Okay, so jumping ahead, at this time, the king was Edward. He was the king of Wessex. And when he was assassinated, as you can see, I'm really skipping over a lot of material. When he was assassinated in 978, the throne was passed to, and this is how he was identified. This is how he's identified by historians. The throne was passed to Athelred the Unready.
What a moniker.
That's what they called him. And if you're interested in all of the details of all of this stuff, the majority of this comes from Joseph Mormon's History of England. With this transition from Edward to Mr. I don't know what I'm doing, this invigorated the Vikings, and they started to launch new attacks along the southern coast. And this led to various things that would ultimately occur. The sacking of Canterbury a couple of hundred years later, where Canterbury was burned, and the Archbishop at the time and many of the citizens were taken prisoner. The Archbishop of Canterbury at this time, this is the 1100s, so I'm going to be skipping around. Alfred was held captive for 4 months because he refused, note this, he refused to force the poor of the area of Canterbury to pay his ransom. They wanted to ransom him, and they said no, and on the 19th of April, he was killed, clubbed or stoned. I'm not really sure, but he was killed around the area of Greenwich. Okay, so by 1016, these new Viking invasions were so successful that the Danish king, Knut, this is a very important character for the development of the English church.
His last name wasn't Rockney, was it?
Not Knut Rockne, no. He made himself the master of England. Now, what was so significant in this declaration that I'm the master of England was he was not a Danish pagan. He actually was a Christian. And in Winchester, the Liber Vitae, Life of Liberty, there's a drawing of King Knut standing by the altar with his hand upon the cross while an angel places the crown upon his head. He arrived and he influenced the church not as an oppressor, but as a protector. And during his reign, he worked closely with the church, fully realizing that he himself had much to learn from the church. Canute the Great comes over, as I said, in 1016. He takes control, and he's a little bit of an unexpected figure. His family is known for being the world's most, his family isn't known for being the world's most enthusiastic Christians, but he is. He wants to govern England, not oppress and rule it. He speaks to bishops. He learns to listen to bishops. He gives monies and estates to the church. he at least comes with a measurable distance of being at least an outwardly pious man, and he rules according to law. A far cry from many of the kings, even some, the English kings before him. So for the 20 years of his reign, from 816 to 1035, he represents, if you will, the final flowering of the Anglo-Saxon church.
Can you give those dates again for him? That didn't sound right.
His reign, 1016 to 1035.
Not 860.
No,
That's what I heard too.
Yeah, 10.
did I say 816?
Uh-huh.
I did say it. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
1016, 1035.
That makes a lot.
Too many dates on this page. Canute appoints a series of very capable bishops. He tends to stay out of church affairs. He encourages monasticism. And by doing this, he is regarded as a patron of learning and patron of the church, and as someone who will lead England in its traditional, by this point, Christian sort of Anglo-Saxon identity. He passed laws protecting the church. He gave gifts to monasteries. He filled his courts with loyal, and I'll use the British pronunciation, clerks. He went on a pilgrimage to Rome and generally behaved as a loyal and dutiful son of the church. His death brought almost a decade of turmoil. That's how influential this man was. So, in AD 1043, after Canute and his sons and blah, 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 Edward, the son of Ethelred the Unready, was crowned king and became the English monarchy. He restored the English monarchy with his ascendancy to the throne. He was born in Islip, Oxfordshire, in about AD 1003, and he was the son of Ethelred I and Emma of Normandy, and that's critical for this reason. I'll tell you in a second. He also had a brother, Alfred, and a sister, Godgevu. I don't make this stuff up. I just report the news. Godgifu.
I'll bet.
I'm not kidding. That was her name. Godgefu. And God bless you to you too. So, I don't know what to tell you. Yeah. History's entertaining all on its own. When the Vikings seized the throne 10 years later in 1013 by King Seweyn, S-W-E-Y-N, Emma fled to Normandy, eventually to be followed by the rest of the family. Edward remained in Normandy for 30 years. He remained in Normandy from the age of 10 to the age of 40, when he returned to England at the death of his father, Ethelred, to assume the throne. Now, this time is very critical because it defines who Edward is and how he would interact in the English monarchy. By all accounts, Edward was a godly man, so much so he earned the title Edward the Confessor. But, as saintly as he might have been, he probably should never have been king. He should never have been governing a country, especially during a tumultuous time. And the primary reason for that is he hated England. He had no interest in England whatsoever. He barely spoke English, hated the English language, and his sympathies lay with his Norman friends and with Normandy. He should never have been ascended to the throne. And there's an odd comparison when you think about it. So you have Canute, a Danish foreigner by birth, that had a great admiration for England, and we have Edward, a native of England, who held the country and its people in considerable contempt. People whom he regarded as essentially This is the typical French. I guess it started all the way back then. He considered the English uncivilized barbarians.
Okay, very French.
His reign manifested the divided nature of England. On the one hand, there was Edward's court, where he was surrounded by Norman clerks and desirous to fill all of the most important offices of the church with his friends from overseas, such as Robert, the abbot of Jumiges, Jumieges, who Edward made Bishop of London in 1044, and then the Archbishop of Canterbury 7 years later. Now, I don't know if you brought your maps with you, and I probably should have told you to bring your maps with you, because a lot of this is going to be discussing areas, but if you don't have your maps, this is what I want you to remember. Do you remember what France looks like? You've got the continent, but then on the coast, it juts out like this, and then it curves in like this, and most of what we're going to talk about happens in that region, the northwestern section, okay? So additionally, Edward maintained a very close relationship and contact with Rome, and eagerly welcomed and entertained papal legates to England when they came to advise him of ecclesiastical affairs. So notice now the shift. Now we're getting more and more not only interested in what's going on in the continent, but now we're getting specifically connected to the papacy. That is not the norm for the whole country, so just keep that in mind. On the other hand, there was the other group, not affiliated with Edward, that was represented by the great earls, like by Godwin and Harold Godwin's son, Godwinson, exactly how it sounds. And these men bitterly resented the intrusion into England by foreigners, and they did their very best to acquire some of the high offices for their supporters. One such supporter was Stigand, Stigand, who was thrust into Canterbury when Robert, the lawful holder of the See of Canterbury, was forced into exile. So, we've got Edward, who's kowtowing to the papacy, and now you have the earls who are resisting that foreign influence. And if you know anything about Arthurian law, if you know anything about English history, there's a document that should be jumping into your mind right about now that will appear in a couple of hundred years that defines the tension between the two, the Magna Carta. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to that, but that does derive from, it grows out of this. Now, Stigand was not just the Archbishop of Canterbury, he was also the Bishop of Winchester and held several abbeys in plurality with Canterbury. So this was a man that had his finger in everything. Not appropriately, I might add. He should have only been the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this went on until he was eventually deposed as a schismatic and a usurper in 1070. He was married, and he had no scruples about enriching his children by the use of church property. I got a nice little church over here for you. You go take that one. And he was so successful at this that the only estates, I want you to keep this in mind, the only estates richer than the Archbishop's estate were the royal estates and those held by Harold Godwinson. He was loaded. Now, at this time, we see others, and I'm just going to throw these names out for you. Willibrord, Willibrord, St. Boniface, and their work tried to maintain a connection between England and Scandinavia in order to promote the conversion of the Vikings and the Scandinavian kingdoms to Christianity. This unfortunately came to an abrupt end at about 1060. Now, at the other end of the spectrum from Stigand was Wulfstan, Wulfstan of Worcester, Worcester, and yes, it is pronounced Worcester, not Worcester. And he was regarded virtually as a living saint. Put an asterisk by his name, because I'm going to come back, I don't know today, but we will come back to him because he plays a very critical role later on. He was brought up a monk and spent most of his time preaching and was eventually elected the Bishop of Worcester with Edward's consent in 1062. But in spite of the confessor's personal holiness, he allowed the church to deteriorate during his reign. His appointments were foolish and arbitrary, and he allowed favorites like Leofric, Leofric, to be the abbot of as many as 5, count them, 5 monasteries. Mike, how easy is it to be some abbot of one order? Sees became filled with bishops of defective character, concerned only with wealth and their worldly estates. Clergy, on the whole, were idiots. They were ignorant. And there was no plan or intention to remedy that deficiency. So for all of whatever Edward was, he had some major holes. The sole positive contribution of Edward's reign was the building of a very, very famous abbey right outside of London proper, Westminster Abbey, which was consecrated on Innocents' Day, December 28, 1065. Unfortunately, Edward was unable to attend the consecration because he was so ill, and he died 6 days later. Edward is replaced by Howard Godwinson, who was king for about a hiccup. And Godwinson was one of those guys who, if it weren't for bad luck, he'd have no luck at all. If he was standing in the rain, if he was standing in a thunderstorm, he would be the last place that you would want to be standing. He would be the last person you would want to be standing next to. He had a brother, Tostig, who was nothing but trouble. He had another brother who basically played politics with a wet finger. Which way is the wind blowing? And anytime he was faced with significant challenges to his leadership, he basically was on his own. And in September of 1066, there isn't a, well, I used to be able to say that. I can't say that now. I used to be able to say there isn't a school child that doesn't know what that date signifies, and now I have no clue whether that's true.
That's right.
One of the most significant dates in history, and anyway, so Godwinson, trying to figure out where his support is going to come from, winds up with his back forced against the wall, so to speak, during the Battle of Hastings. And for all of his wonderful characteristics as a man, he has the ignominious moniker of being remembered as the king who lost England. As an administrator of the church, well, he left much to be desired. But as a king, he did lead with good intentions, he tried to do the right thing. So, in AD 1066, he mustered the army of England. He marches north, and he meets the invading army led by the Norwegian king Harold, Hardrada, Hardrada, at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York. Again, notice we're mentioning York again, and we're going to mention York numerous times. But if you're looking at your map of England now, if you'll remember Scotland way up here, right? And England's coming down, and you have that little bulge out on the coast, and then you come down. If the boundary of Scotland and England is here, York is like right here, right there. And if you've ever seen Braveheart, you know why York is so significant. Okay. He meets Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, and Hardrada was he was just overconfident, and Harold overwhelms him because of the carelessness of his army. Of the 7 kings that accompanied Hardrada in the invasion of England, 1 survived. That's how thorough the victory was for Harold Godwinson. 1. He literally decimated their army. The only one who seems to have escaped was Godrad, G-O-D-R-A-D, Crovan, C-R-O-V-A-N. You don't have to remember him. He was the king of Man. Okay? So the only reason some of us remember this is because our former bishop has an affinity for the Isle of Man, and that's who was the king. Every other king died on the battlefield. Now, having defeated Hardrada, Godwinson received the news that William the Duke of Normandy had landed on the south coast. Now, York is here, right? William lands all the way here. So, if the eastern shoreline is here, right? William lands over here. And am I gonna jump ahead? No, I'm not. He lands at Pevensey Bay, P-E-V-N-S-Y, of East Sussex. Now you notice that the names of the 7 kingdoms keep cropping up here and there. So William the Conqueror lands here, but Harold Godwinson is all the way up here. And he had just finished a major battle with the Danish king. So what is he going to do? So he has to disengage his army from up here and force march 240 miles southeast to meet the southern coast and the threat. Now here's the problem historically and politically. William the Conqueror came to England. He landed on the shore to assume the throne because he was promised the throne by none other than Edward the Confessor. So for William, this was almost a crusade. Now, we're going to start talking about William, and when I learned about William the Conqueror, I learned about him as a massive historical figure and the importance that he had in history. He has an even great, in my estimation, an even greater importance in the history of the English Church. We will talk about that. He sought and received the support of both Pope Alexander II and the very, very influential Archdeacon of Rome, Hildebrand. Remember that name, because he will suddenly become a pope later on. The interesting aspect of William's invasion is he came as a churchman. Notice, Canute, William are more interested in the advancement of the English church than the English kings. So, he was so let me see how do I want to phrase this. He was so much so viewed as a churchman that when he landed at Pevensey, many of the leaders of the church were prepared to welcome him. So you've got British clergy now. So William now marches his army northeast. He marches from Pevensey in the southwest to Hastings, approximately 12 miles northeast of where he lands. As Harold rushed to engage him, Harold's army becomes undisciplined. And what winds up happening was the Normans do, this is a military tactic that has been used by everybody from Joshua to Hannibal to Scipio Africanus. I mean, every great military leader has used this at one point or another. And what William did was, as he was in Hastings and Harold was coming down south, what did William do? He sees Harold coming over the Senlac Hill, and I'll get to that in a second. He sees Harold coming over the hill, and what does he do? He withdraws. And he withdraws. And he withdraws. Well, what does that do? That sucks Harold's army in, and he sucks it in, and he sucks it in, and now he's enveloped on both sides. Harold's army turns around and literally decimates. William's army turns around and literally decimates Harold's forces. Harold is left making a stand with his housecarls, House, housecarls, Carls. Basically, those were a type of bodyguard and non-servile servants. They were conscripted financially. And he's left on the top of Senlac Hill, and he dies in battle, and for all intents and purposes, that spelled the end of the Anglo-Saxon England. With Harold's death, we now enter a very, very different stage in the history of England. For the first 500 years, England had gone her own way, done her own thing. She was cut off from the broader church on the continent. Now, for the next 500 years, she'll be brought more and more under the influence of Rome, and thus she starts to lose some of her independence and some of her distinctive character. Now, 1066 is, as we all know from our grammar school days, a very important date. Something else happened that actually bears on English history that occurred in 1066. And I'll even give you the date that it occurred, 23 April 1066. Does anybody by any stretch know what happened on that date? On April 23rd, 1066, Halley's Comet came closest to the Earth at that time. It was originally seen in the sky, I believe it was around the 20th of March, but on its travels, by the 23rd of April, it had reached its closest point to Earth. Now, why is that even mentioned? It's mentioned because when you read English history of this time period, the commentators attribute the loss of English succession to the appearance of Halley's Comet. This is in the annals of English history. Just a little tidbit for you. Okay. The rest of the lecture focuses on William and his rule, but we only have a few more minutes. Do you want to pause right now for questions, and then we can pick this up next week? Does that sound good? Okay. So, any questions on what we covered? I want to say this again. If you can't miss a lecture, don't miss this. Don't miss William's influence, because he established, these are just some of the things that are a result of William. He was incredibly important in the development of the English church. And I'll point out one thing just so that it kind of whets your appetite. He was the nascent form of Erastianism, the state running the church. And that creates major tension shortly after his death. So I can't think of a better tease than that, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So yeah, if you have to make, if you can't miss it, I don't know how to phrase it, don't miss next week. So, questions, anybody, questions? Yeah, Taylor.
How did the system of succession work back in those days? It seems like it's kind of
It is.
jumping around.
It's arbitrary and random. To give you the very, very skeptical response, who can it really is so convoluted. There's so many different elements to it. For instance, we get the hereditary line. Who marrying who makes who better, right? We also get Edward. What business did he have? What business did Edward the Confessor have offering the throne of England to a Norman king? But he did, because that's where his affections lay.
But his offer was basically, when I die, you're going to take over.
That was it.
He was just naming.
That was it. He just named his successor. Yeah. And then, of course, there was money. We won't be able to cover a lot, but you'll see that there are people that will say, man, that chair looks really good. I think I could really enjoy that. And then you'll say, really? Well, for a nominal fee, we may be able to work something out. Boom, and now you're king. And this is one of the reasons that you see Harold Godwin, where you see Godwin and Harold Godwinson. Their money wound up so influential in their position in assuming the throne. So, it was a bit of a mess. It really didn't begin to, and I'm going out on a limb, but it didn't begin, there's a time bomb ticking, I'm hearing. There's a,
Sorry.
what is that? There's a period during the next couple of 100 years where it kind of sort of settles down a little bit to be passed on through heredity. So sons will then essentially become the rulers, but at this point, it's coin toss.
But absent that, is it kind of a matter of, there's this set of aristocrats that they endorse somebody, and that might be because of money, or it might be because of
Well, if you're thinking is,
like how does it actually get conferred at that point?
oh, well, that becomes an issue later on in the investiture question. So we will get to the investiture issue briefly. We're not going to be able to discuss all of it, but we will get to the investiture question. And somebody that we all know very well is involved in the investiture question, St. Anselm. So it may not, oh, you're going to be gone.
Yeah.
Well, you'll have access. You'll have access to it. But at that time, it really was, to be honest, it really was catch as catch can. The more power you had, the easier it was for you to say, you know, Edward was the heir to Athelred, right? So he had a little bit of royal lineage, so he had a little bit of clout. But he had major opposition because he was he was a French snob. Even though he was a Brit, he epitomized what we think of a Parisian today. You know, you stink, my friend, go away. I mean that's, you know, every time, again, this shows you my own insanity. Every time I think of Edward, do you know what I think of? I think of the Holy Grail, and I think of John Cleese at the top of the mountain. Go away, you English niggets! I mean, you know, I will taunt you a second time. This is what I'm thinking of when I'm watching this. You know, your mother smells of elderberries. You know. It's just, this is the French, and this was Edward. I mean, it's really funny. And you got to give those guys credit for being able to really tap into that. But anyway, that's off on a tangent. So hopefully that at least gives you an idea. We'll get into the investiture question next week, actually, and that'll probably clear up some things. Yes, ma'am.
Why was he called the Confessor, Edward, do you know?
Because of his spiritual piety and his devotion to the church. He was one of those men that spent a lot of time talking to priests, and he not only confessed, his foibles, but he also confessed Christianity. So he really was a very for who he was a very spiritual guy. He just didn't want to be in England. I mean, that's the bottom line. He didn't like Great Britain, even though that was his native country.
So did the Normans think that Halley's Comet was what gave them success?
Well, I have not encountered any. I have not encountered any documentation by the Normans thinking that it was any sort of cosmic influence. And if you take William as an example, or at least at this time, if you take William as the individual that was setting the tone for what would happen in the future, being a staunch Christian, I don't think that he would have played into that.
Do you think he thought it was God that gave him the victory then?
He would have thought, yeah. He was a devout man. Wait till you see, next week when we start talking about him and what he did, it's actually, I brought this because I was going to read this. He wrote a letter to the Pope. He and the Pope, I'll let this out. Hildebrand became Pope Gregory VII. Okay, the famous Archdeacon of Rome, Hildebrand, becomes Pope Gregory VII. And Pope Gregory VII was expecting certain things from the King of England. King of England, William, had other ideas. And Gregory writes a letter to William, and William's response will be read next week. And in William's response is essentially the core of English identity. He establishes, gosh,
Dave Kaplan, up your nose with a rubber hose.
no, not that bad. Not that bad. Let's just say this. With William, you find a monarch that is more English than the English monarchs. And what he establishes provides the seed not only for the church, but for English identity and an English ethos. So today. That's how significant William is. And that's why it's kind of frustrating. As I've said, my minor is ancient history, Roman and Greek. But you have to brush up against some of this. And the more I started to study English history, the more I realized he gets a really short shrift for the influence that he... I mean, Erastianism alone is a significant innovation and introduction into the church and into British history. And that creates some of the controversy with investiture. And I'm not going to say anything about investiture. You got to come back next week so I can define it for you. You'll all go look it up on Google, and that's fine. But this is a man that probably should get far more, as much of the historical attention that he receives. He should get even more because of the impact that he had on the English church.